James lived a quiet life in Oakwood Estates for 15 years. His cozy house sat at the end of a peaceful street, right next to some woods. Everyone liked James. He always paid his HOA fees on time, kept his yard looking nice, and showed up to neighborhood cookouts with his famous potato salad. Life was good until Mrs. Wilcox took over the neighborhood association 3 years ago. Folks called her HOA Karen behind her back. She moved in and quickly took charge, pushing out the old, friendly president. She promised everyone their homes would be worth more money if she made people follow the rules more strictly. One cool fall morning, James checked his mailbox and found a cream-colored envelope with the HOA logo. His heart sank as he opened it. There was a notice saying he broke the rules because leaves from his big old oak tree were falling onto the street. The fine was $100 for each day until he fixed it, already adding up to $2,800. At the bottom was Mrs. Wilcox's fancy signature with a handwritten note. "Rules are rules, James. No exceptions." James couldn't believe it. He called Mrs. Wilcox right away, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mrs. Wilcox, this fine seems a bit much for some autumn leaves. The tree's been there longer than any of our houses. The rules clearly say homeowners must keep the street in front of their property clean," she said in that know-it-all voice that made his skin crawl. "Your tree, your responsibility. I don't make the rules, I just enforce them." But as James hung up the phone, he knew better. This wasn't really about leaves at all. This was payback. 3 times he had voted against Mrs. Wilcox's plans to raise everyone's fees for improving the neighborhood entrance. Those improvements would have put a lot of money in her brother-in-law's pocket since he owned the landscaping company that would do the work. James looked out his window at the magnificent oak tree. Its branches spread wide, giving shade in summer and a shower of golden leaves in fall. Kids from around the neighborhood loved climbing it. For 15 years, no one had complained about its leaves. He grabbed his rake and headed outside. The crisp air filled his lungs as he started raking, wondering how he'd ever pay such a massive fine on his modest salary. His neighbor Tom walked by with his dog. "What's with all the raking, James? You're working up quite a sweat there." James explained about the fine, showing Tom the notice. Tom's friendly face turned serious. "She's been on a power trip lately. Gave the Thompsons a fine for their kids' basketball hoop being visible from the street. Even made Mrs. Chen take down her little garden gnome collection, said they weren't aesthetically consistent with neighborhood standards." What does that even mean? As they talked, more neighbors stopped by. Everyone had a story about Mrs. Wilcox and her rules. Some had paid small fines to avoid trouble, but nobody had been hit with something as big as $2,800. "You should fight this," said Tom, helping James gather the last of the leaves. "If she gets away with this, who knows what she'll do next?" James nodded, looking at the pile of leaves they'd gathered. He was a peaceful man who avoided conflict, but sometimes a person has to stand up for what's right. Little did he know that this pile of autumn leaves would start a battle that would change everything in Oakwood Estates. That night, as James sat at his kitchen table staring at the fine notice, he made a decision. He wouldn't just pay up and keep quiet like everyone else had done. Somehow, he would find a way to stand up to Mrs. Wilcox and her unfair rules. He just needed to figure out how. The next morning, James spent 3 hours raking every single leaf from the street. His back ached, but he felt satisfied looking at the spotless pavement. He called Mrs. Wilcox to request a new inspection. "I'll be there at 2 p.m. sharp," she said. "Don't waste my time if you haven't fixed everything." At exactly 2 p.m., Mrs. Wilcox's shiny blue SUV pulled up. She stepped out holding her clipboard, pearl necklace bouncing as she walked. James smiled and pointed to the perfectly clean street. All clear now, not a leaf in sight. Mrs. Wilcox barely glanced at the street. Instead, she walked straight to his mailbox and pulled out a measuring tape from her pocket. "Your mailbox is 2 inches taller than the rules allow," she said, writing something on her clipboard. "That's another violation." She looked up at his house. "And your front door has faded. The color doesn't match what's in the approved list anymore." James felt his face getting hot. The mailbox has been this height for 15 years, and the door just needs a fresh coat of the same paint. "Rules are rules," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That'll be $200 for the mailbox and $300 for the door. You have 7 days to fix both problems." Over the next few weeks, James tried his best to follow the rules. He lowered his mailbox and repainted his door. But each time Mrs. Wilcox found something new wrong. The paint sheen is semi-gloss, not satin finish as required. Your grass is a quarter-inch too high in this corner. Your trash can was visible from the street for 15 minutes after collection. The fines kept growing. $500 here, $1,000 there. James tried talking to other HOA board members, but they all sided with Mrs. Wilcox. They were afraid of becoming her next target. One evening, James invited some neighbors over for coffee. Tom came, along with the Wangs from across the street and old Mr. Baker from the corner house. "She's really got it in for you," said Tom, stirring his coffee. "Reminds me of what happened to the Johnsons last year." "What happened to them?" James asked. "They were such nice people. I wondered why they moved so suddenly." Mr. Baker shook his head. Mrs. Wilcox kept finding rule violations with their yard decorations. Called their garden gnomes an infestation. Fined them so much they couldn't pay their mortgage anymore. Lost their house. Mrs. Wang nodded. "And remember the Indian family that used to live next to you? The Kumas?" She fined them because she said their cooking smells were decreasing neighborhood appeal. They got tired of fighting and moved away. James felt sick. She can't just bully people out of their homes. "She's got most of the board in her pocket," said Tom. "Her friend owns the towing company that gets all the HOA business. Another one sells insurance to the association. They all benefit." After 3 months of constant violations, James' fines had reached nearly $50,000. His savings account was empty, and he'd maxed out his credit cards trying to keep up. Then came the worst news in a certified letter. Mrs. Wilcox had placed a line on his house. If he didn't pay everything by the end of the month, foreclosure proceedings would begin. James requested an emergency HOA meeting. He spent days gathering evidence, taking photos of other homes with the same violations that weren't being fined. He made charts showing how the fines had suddenly increased after he voted against Mrs. Wilcox's proposals. The meeting room was packed. James presented his case clearly, showing everyone the unfair treatment. Some neighbors nodded in agreement. For a moment, he felt hopeful. Then Mrs. Wilcox straightened her pearl necklace and called for a vote. All in favor of upholding the fines against Mr. Harris. 4 hands went up, Mrs. Wilcox and her 3 friends on the board. Only one board member, old Mrs. Peterson, voted to drop the fines. The vote is 4-1. The fines stand. Mrs. Wilcox announced with a cold smile. "Pay by the end of the month, or we begin foreclosure. Your house will make a lovely addition to our community properties." Walking home that night, James felt defeated. The house he'd loved for 15 years, where he planted every tree and shrub by hand, would soon be taken away. All because of some leaves that fell from a tree that had stood for over 100 years. He sat on his porch steps, looking up at the stars. He wasn't a fighter by nature. He'd always believed in following rules and being a good neighbor. But sometimes, when the rules aren't fair, you have to find another way. "I'm not giving up," he whispered to himself. "There has to be a way out of this mess." The next morning, James woke up early. He couldn't sleep anyway, thinking about losing his home. He made himself some coffee and sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by piles of HOA violation notices. There had to be a way out of this mess. His phone rang. It was his friend Tom. "Hey buddy, I've been thinking about your situation all night. My cousin is a lawyer who deals with property issues. Her name is Lisa Gonzalez. You should talk to her." James sighed. "I can't afford a lawyer right now, Tom. That's the whole problem." "Just call her. Tell her I sent you. She hates bullies, especially HOA bullies. She might be able to help." With nothing to lose, James called Lisa's office. When he mentioned Tom's name, she agreed to see him that same day. Lisa's office was small but neat. Family photos covered her desk, and law books filled the shelves. She was a short woman with bright eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. "So you're up against that HOA dragon," she said after hearing his story. "These fines are ridiculous. I've seen this before. Someone gets a little power and goes crazy with it." She'd flipped through his stack of violations. "Fighting these directly will cost a lot and take forever. AOAs have strong legal protection. We need another way to tackle this." "What other way is there?" James asked. "She's about to take my house." Lisa tapped her pen on the desk. Let me look into the history of your neighborhood. Sometimes there are things in the original property documents that can help us. Property law is funny, old rules can still matter today. For the next 3 days, Lisa dug through county records, property deeds, and development plans from when Oakwood Estates was first built 30 years ago. James helped by gathering old HOA meeting minutes and talking to neighbors who had lived there from the beginning. On the third day, Lisa called James, excitement in her voice. I found something big. Come to my office right away. When James arrived, Lisa spread out several maps and documents on her desk. Look at this, she said, pointing to an old property map. When they built your neighborhood, something interesting happened. The developer never officially gave the streets to the city. James looked confused. What does that mean? It means your street isn't actually a public road. It's private property that's split between all the homeowners on the street. Each of you owns the piece of road in front of your house, all the way to the middle of the street. James leaned closer to the map. Are you sure? Lisa nodded. Absolutely. I double-checked with the county assessor's office. The HOA has been treating it like a public street, but legally you own part of it. She pulled out another map that showed property lines. Here's the really interesting part. Your property is at the entrance to the cul-de-sac, right? According to these documents, your property includes not just your yard, but extends to the middle of the road, including the only entrance and exit to the 5 houses at the end of the street. James's eyes widened. You mean? Yes. You own the road that Mrs. Wilcox and her neighbors drive on every day to get to their houses, and under state law, you have the right to control access to your private property. For the first time in months, James smiled. So I could. You could legally restrict who drives on your property, Lisa said with a small smile. But let's be careful here. We need to do this by the book. James sat back in his chair, thinking. Mrs. Wilcox used the HOA rules against me. Maybe it's time to use actual property laws against her. Exactly, Lisa said. The HOA has power, but property rights are protected by state law, which is much stronger. They can't just take away your property rights, no matter what their rules say. James felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. He wasn't powerless after all. What's the first step? He asked. We need to file for an official survey to mark the exact boundaries of your property. Then we register those boundaries with the county. After that, we can apply for permits to modify your driveway. My driveway? Well, technically it is your driveway. It's just that other people have been using it to get to their houses. But legally, it's your property. As James left Lisa's office, he felt hope for the first time in months. The giant oak tree that started all this trouble had stood for over 100 years, weathering storms and droughts. Maybe it was teaching him something, that sometimes you need deep roots and patience to survive. When he got home, he noticed Mrs. Wilcox watching from her porch as surveyors began marking property lines with bright orange flags. She probably thought he was getting ready to sell his house before the foreclosure. She had no idea what was really happening. Just you wait, James whispered to himself. Just you wait. James and Lisa worked carefully over the next few weeks. They didn't want to make any mistakes that Mrs. Wilcox could use against them. First, they had professional surveyors mark the exact boundaries of James's property. The results confirmed what Lisa had discovered. James owned 62 feet of the only road leading into the cul-de-sac where Mrs. Wilcox and 4 other families lived. Next, they filed paperwork with the county to officially record these property lines. Lisa made sure every form was filled out perfectly. They submitted everything with copies of the original deeds and development plans to prove their case. How long will this take? James asked as they left the county clerk's office. Usually a few weeks, but I know someone here, Lisa said with a wink. I helped the clerk's mother with a landlord problem last year. He promised to put our paperwork at the top of the pile. Sure enough, just 10 days later, they received official confirmation. The county recognized James as the legal owner of that section of road. Now they could move to the next step, applying for permits to modify what was officially his private driveway. We need to be smart about this, Lisa said. We'll apply for a security improvement permit. Given all the delivery thefts in neighborhoods these days, no one will question it. James submitted plans for a security gate and a small booth, what he called a visitor verification station. The permits were approved within days. While they waited, James noticed Mrs. Wilcox watching the surveyors with curiosity. She even walked over one day when he was checking the mailbox. "What's with all the surveying?" she asked, clipboard in hand as always. "Planning some landscaping before you move out?" James smiled politely. "Just confirming my property boundaries. Always good to know exactly what you own, don't you think?" Mrs. Wilcox's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing and walked away. James spent evenings researching security gates and toll systems. He found a local company that specialized in neighborhood entrance gates. They were excited about his project, especially when he explained the situation. "So this HOA lady has been making your life miserable, and now you're going to make her pay. Literally, to drive home." The company owner, a stocky man named Frank, laughed heartily. "Count me in. I had an HOA try to fine me for my work truck being in my own driveway. I've been waiting for a chance to get back at one of these power-hungry HOAs." Frank offered James a discount and promised to make the toll booth extra nice. "We'll make it look professional, like those fancy neighborhood entrances in the rich part of town. But this one will have a toll system that would make the highway department jealous." One evening, Tom came over to see how things were going. James showed him the plans. "This is brilliant," Tom said, studying the blueprints spread across the kitchen table. "But won't Mrs. Wilcox just shoot you once she realizes what you're doing?" "Lisa says she can try, but property rights are pretty much sacred in this state. As long as we follow all the rules and get proper permits, there's not much she can do." "What about the other neighbors who live back there? They'll have to pay tolls too." James nodded. "I've thought about that. I'll set a very low toll for regular neighbors, like $1, just enough to be legal. But for Mrs. Wilcox," he grinned mischievously, "well, let's just say her toll will help pay off my HOA fines." The day the construction crew arrived, the neighborhood burst into a flurry of gossip and excitement. By lunchtime, concrete posts had been installed on either side of the road exactly at James's property line. Metal tracks for the gate were embedded in the pavement. Mrs. Wilcox stormed out of her house when she saw what was happening. She marched straight to where James was talking with the construction foreman. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, face red with anger. "You can't block a neighborhood street. This is outrageous." James handed her a folder containing copies of all his permits and property documents. "Actually, according to county records and my deed, I can. This section of road is my property. It always has been. The neighborhood has been using my private driveway as a public road for years, but legally, it belongs to me." Mrs. Wilcox flipped through the documents, her face growing paler by the second. This is impossible. The HOA will fight this. We'll sue you into bankruptcy." "You're welcome to try," James replied calmly. "But while you're preparing your case, you should know that I've already been approved to install a security gate and toll collection system on my property. Construction will be finished by the end of the week." Mrs. Wilcox's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. For once, she seemed at a loss for words. "You'll be hearing from our lawyers," she finally sputtered before storming back to her house. As she walked away, several neighbors who had gathered to watch the commotion started to clap quietly. Old Mr. Baker gave James a thumbs up from across the street. James felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. There was no going back now. His plan was in motion, and soon Mrs. Wilcox would learn that rules worked both ways. The construction crew worked quickly. Within just a week, the security gate and toll booth were nearly complete. Frank and his team outdid themselves. The booth looked professional with a small roof, sliding windows, and even a tiny heater for cold days. The automatic gate had a card reader for regular users and a camera system to identify cars. Mrs. Wilcox hadn't wasted any time. She called an emergency HOA meeting for that evening at the community center. Every homeowner received a notice with bold red letters, "UOGNT, illegal road blockage threat." James was nervous about facing everyone, but Lisa assured him he was on solid legal ground. "Just stay calm and stick to the facts. I'll be right there with you." When they arrived, the room was packed. Mrs. Wilcox stood at the front, pearl necklace gleaming under the fluorescent lights. But James noticed something unexpected. Many neighbors were smiling at him as he walked in. Tom had been busy spreading the word about what was happening. Mrs. Wilcox banged her gavel to start the meeting. "We are facing an unprecedented attack on our community. Mr. Harris is attempting to block a public road and extort money from his neighbors. Before she could continue, Lisa stood up. Excuse me, Mrs. Wilcox, but there are some legal facts that everyone should know. Lisa explained in simple terms how the road was actually private property according to county records. She passed around copies of the official documents showing the property lines and permits. Bottom line, this section of road legally belongs to Mr. Harris. It has never been dedicated to the city or the HOA. He has every right to control access to his property, just as each of you has the right to control access to your driveways and yards. The room buzzed with whispers. Then Bill Henderson, a quiet man who rarely spoke at meetings, stood up. He had been fined last year for having the wrong brand of bird feeder. So you're telling us that one man's driveway is the only way into our cul-de-sac, and the HOA never bothered to check this in all these years? That's correct, Lisa nodded. And now he's going to charge us all tolls to get to our homes. Another neighbor asked. James stood up. I want to be clear about something. This whole situation started because I was unfairly fined nearly $50,000 for things like leaves falling from my tree. I've lived here for 15 years without problems until recently. He looked around the room. I don't want to punish my neighbors. The toll for regular residents will be just $1 per crossing, the minimum legally required to establish it as a toll road rather than a public easement. And all money collected will go toward paying off these HOA fines that I believe were unfairly imposed. He paused, then added, there will be one exception to the $1 toll. All eyes turned to Mrs. Wilcox, who was turning redder by the second. 2 days later, the toll booth was complete. It looked even better than James had hoped. Frank had added nice landscaping around it with small flower beds. A large professional sign was mounted above the gate. Private HOA to access. Residents, $1 per crossing. Mrs. Wilcox, $50 per crossing. All fees collected go toward James Harris's HOA fines. Trespassers will be towed at vehicle owner's expense. James had arranged for every resident to receive an electronic pass they could keep in their car for easy access. They could pay their $1 toll weekly or monthly if they preferred. Everyone except Mrs. Wilcox. The morning the toll booth went into operation, James sat inside wearing a blue button-up shirt that matched the booth's trim. He had a small cash box, a credit card reader, and a logbook to track all payments. Everything was official and by the book, just as Lisa had advised. At exactly 7:30 a.m., Mrs. Wilcox's shiny blue SUV approached the gate. She stopped, window down, face twisted with anger. This is illegal harassment. Move this gate immediately, or I'll call the police. James smiled politely. Good morning, Mrs. Wilcox. Your toll is $50. Will that be cash, credit, or debit? I am not paying any toll to drive on a neighborhood street. This is outrageous. James calmly pointed to the folder of legal documents on his small desk. Actually, this isn't a neighborhood street. It's my private property as confirmed by the county assessor's office. I'm legally allowed to control access, just like you're allowed to keep people off your lawn. He tilted his head. You know, it's interesting how property rights work. Some might say it's like rules are rules. Isn't that what you always told me? Mrs. Wilcox's face was now almost purple with rage. The HOA lawyers will shut this down by this afternoon. Just you wait. You're welcome to try, James replied. In the meantime, that'll be $50 to pass through my property. Mrs. Wilcox slammed her car into reverse, nearly hitting the mailbox behind her. She sped away, presumably to park on the main street and walk home. As she drove away, Tom pulled up in his pickup truck. He handed James a dollar bill with a huge grin. Best dollar I've ever spent, he laughed. Did you see her face? I thought she was going to explode. Throughout the day, neighbors came through the toll. Most were smiling or laughing. Some brought James coffee or cookies. Mrs. Henderson brought him a homemade sandwich for lunch. It felt like the community was coming together. All except for one very angry woman who now had to park a half-mile away and walk to her house in her fancy shoes. As the sun began to set, James looked at his logbook. He had collected $27 from neighbors and felt more connected to his community than ever before. The huge weight of those unfair fines didn't seem quite so heavy anymore. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Mrs. Wilcox wouldn't give up easily. But for now, sitting in his little toll booth surrounded by flowers and goodwill from his neighbors, James felt something he hadn't felt in months: hope. For the first 3 days, Mrs. Wilcox refused to pay the toll. She parked her fancy SUV on the main street and walked half a mile to her house, carrying her designer purse and grocery bags. The neighbors watched with amusement as she struggled along in her high-heeled shoes, her face getting redder with each step. By the 4th day, a spring rainstorm hit. James sat in his toll booth, warm and dry, watching the heavy drops splash against the windows. Around 6 p.m., Mrs. Wilcox's blue SUV approached the gate. Her hair was plastered to her head, makeup running down her face. She looked miserable. $50, James said simply. With shaking hands, she handed over her credit card. "This isn't over," she muttered as the gate lifted. The next morning was clear and sunny. James arrived early to open the toll booth and found deep tire tracks in the mud beside his gate. During the night, someone had tried to drive around the toll booth by cutting across the corner of his yard. Looking down the street, he saw Mrs. Wilcox's SUV parked in her driveway. The front bumper was covered in mud, and one headlight was cracked. She must have tried to sneak past during the night, but got stuck in the soft ground after the rain. That afternoon, Tom helped James install large decorative boulders along both sides of the toll area. No more shortcuts for Mrs. Wilcox, Tom laughed as they positioned the last rock. 2 days later, Mrs. Wilcox tried something new. She approached the gate at full speed, apparently planning to crash through. James hit the emergency button just in time, making the gate more solid. The impact damaged her car badly: broken headlights, crumpled hood, and a cracked windshield. James called the police, who cited Mrs. Wilcox for destruction of private property. The repair bill for her car came to $3,200, and she had to pay $800 to fix the gate. Word of the toll booth spread beyond Oakwood Estates. A local news reporter heard about the story and came to interview James. The headline in the next day's paper read, "Man creates toll road to fight HOA bullying." People from neighboring towns drove by just to see the famous toll booth and take selfies with James. Most of the residents found the situation more amusing than inconvenient. The $1 toll was a small price to pay for the entertainment value. James always had change ready for them and often offered cold water or lemonade while they chatted. Many said they hardly noticed the toll anymore. It had become part of their daily routine, like stopping for a friendly hello with a neighbor. James kept careful records of all the money collected. He created what he called a fine relief fund, with a plan to help any neighbor who might face unfair HOA penalties in the future. After 3 weeks of operation, the other residents had had enough of Mrs. Wilcox's increasingly desperate attempts to regain control. They called a special HOA meeting, not in the community center, but in Tom's backyard, so they could speak freely. "We need to vote out the current board," said Bill Henderson. "They've let this power go to their heads." "I never thought I'd say this," added Mrs. Lee from down the street, "but I actually enjoy stopping at James's toll booth. He always has a kind word, and my grandkids love getting the little hard candies he keeps for them." The vote was unanimous. 3 of Mrs. Wilcox's allies were removed from the board, replaced by homeowners who promised a more reasonable approach. Their first official act was to review all outstanding HOA fines. Meanwhile, Mrs. Wilcox wasn't giving up. She hired an expensive lawyer and filed for an emergency injunction against James's toll booth. The case landed on Judge Walker's desk, a man known for his no-nonsense approach to neighborhood disputes after 30 years on the bench. The courtroom was packed on hearing day. Mrs. Wilcox's lawyer argued that the toll booth was harassment and created an undue burden on residents. Lisa calmly presented the property records, permits, and documentation of the HOA's excessive fines against James. She showed photos of other violations in the neighborhood that hadn't been fined and played a recording of Mrs. Wilcox saying she would make an example of James. Judge Walker reviewed everything carefully. His gray eyebrows furrowed as he read through the stack of HOA violation notices. $300 for a door paint that's satin instead of eggshell finish, he muttered. Good grief. After an hour of deliberation, he returned with his decision. The plaintiff has failed to show that the defendant does not have the legal right to control access to his private property, Judge Walker announced. The property records clearly show Mr. Harris owns this section of road. Further, the evidence suggests the differential pricing structure is based on a documented history of targeted harassment by the plaintiff. He looked directly at Mrs. Wilcox. This court will not intervene when someone legally exercises their property rights, even if it inconveniences others. The request for injunction is denied. Outside the courthouse, neighbors congratulated James and Lisa. Even people from other HOA neighborhoods came to shake his hand and share their own stories of unreasonable rules and excessive fines. "You're a hero, man," said a guy from a nearby subdivision. "HOAs all over town are suddenly being more reasonable. Nobody wants to be the next Mrs. Wilcox." That evening, as James sat in his toll booth watching the sunset, he felt strangely at peace. The fight wasn't over. Mrs. Wilcox would surely try something else, but for now, he had won. More importantly, he had shown that one person could stand up to unfairness and make a difference. His phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "Check your bank account." James opened his banking app and gasped. The new HOA board had just transferred $42,000 back to his account, all the fines he had paid over the past months. The message line simply read, "Refund for improper enforcement, with apologies." 6 weeks after the toll booth first opened, it had become more than just a way for James to fight back against unfair fines. It had turned into a neighborhood landmark. Kids would wave as they passed through with their parents. Delivery drivers knew James by name and often stopped to chat. James had collected enough in tolls to cover $8,000 of his original fines, mostly from the occasional times Mrs. Wilcox had to drive home when she forgot important things like her medicine or laptop. But the $42,000 refund from the HOA meant he was now completely debt-free. The new HOA board, led by Tom as president, had been busy making changes. They rewrote many of the old rules to be clearer and fairer. Most importantly, they created new limits on fines, no more than $100 for any single violation, and set up an appeals process where homeowners could challenge unfair penalties. No more surprise $50,000 bills, Tom explained at a community cookout, and no more single person having all the power. Mrs. Wilcox had grown increasingly isolated. Neighbors who once supported her now avoided her at the grocery store. The few times she tried to complain about other people's yards or decorations, they simply reminded her about the toll booth incident. One Tuesday morning, a for sale sign appeared in front of Mrs. Wilcox's house. The listing online specifically mentioned unique private road access with small fee. Her real estate agent had insisted on disclosing the toll booth situation to potential buyers. A week later, moving trucks arrived. James watched from his toll booth as workers carried furniture and boxes out of Mrs. Wilcox's house all day. Around sunset, her blue SUV approached his gate for what would likely be the final time. James expected her to drive past without stopping. The gate would open automatically for recognized residents. But to his surprise, she pulled up and rolled down her window. Her face looked tired, the usual anger replaced with something like resignation. "I suppose you're happy now," she said, not meeting his eyes. "You've won." James took a deep breath. For months, he had dreamed of this moment, the chance to say something clever or cutting to the woman who had nearly cost him his home. But looking at her now, he felt no joy in her defeat. "This was never about winning," he said quietly. "It was about fairness. That's all anyone ever wanted." He pressed the button to raise the gate. "Today's toll is waived. Consider it a going-away present." Mrs. Wilcox looked surprised, but nodded slightly before driving through. As her car disappeared down the street, Tom's pickup truck pulled up to the booth. "Was that the dragon lady leaving for good?" Tom asked with a grin. "Looks like it," James replied. "Well, I've got news," Tom said, handing James an official-looking envelope. "The board voted last night. We'd like to buy this section of road from you. Fair market value, of course. It'll be maintained as a public easement for all residents." James opened the envelope and whistled at the amount offered. "There's more," Tom continued. "We've unanimously elected you as chairman of the newly formed Rules Enforcement Ethics Committee. Basically, your job would be to make sure nobody ever abuses HOA power again." James laughed. From rule breaker to rule maker. Who would have thought? That weekend, the whole neighborhood gathered to help dismantle the toll booth. Kids climbed on the now unused gate while parents chatted and shared food. It felt like the whole community had come together to close this chapter. In place of the booth, they planted a small garden with flowers and shrubs. A decorative stone sign was installed that read, "Welcome to Oakwood Estates, where good neighbors make good fences unnecessary." The old oak tree that had started all the trouble still dropped its leaves every autumn. But now, instead of being a source of conflict, it became the center of a new neighborhood tradition. Each fall, neighbors would gather for a leaf-raking party that ended with hot apple cider and homemade cookies in James's front yard. The following spring, a young family moved into Mrs. Wilcox's old house. They had 2 small children and a friendly golden retriever. On moving day, James brought over a welcome basket with bread, coffee, and a small potted plant. "Thanks for the warm welcome," said the new owner as they stood on the porch. "Our last neighborhood wasn't very friendly. The HOA there was a nightmare." "You don't need to worry about that here," James assured them. "We've learned some important lessons about what makes a real community." As he walked home, James looked at the houses along his street, homes where he now knew everyone by name. He thought about how sometimes the worst situations can bring out the best in people. His fight against unfair rules had actually made the neighborhood stronger and closer than ever before. That evening, as the sun set behind his oak tree, James sat on his porch swing with a cup of tea. The tree's branches swayed gently in the breeze, its leaves rustling like they were telling their own story, one about standing strong, putting down roots, and weathering storms together. Just like trees, James thought, communities grow stronger when they face challenges. And sometimes, the most unexpected things, like a toll booth on a quiet suburban street, can bring people together in ways no one could have imagined.